What's up, Playground? It's me, Shanila, and welcome back to the Shadow Work series. This is a 22-part series where we're talking about the ins and outs of shadow work and as it relates to your healing journey. Now, shadow work is the deep, dark parts of yourself that you don't really want to face because it's icky and murky, but it's totally worthwhile on your process of self-mastery and self-development in your healing journey. So if you're not already subscribed to the podcast or have listened to the previous episodes all around this shadow work series, go ahead and make sure you're subscribed so that you get a notification anytime a new episode comes out in this 22-part series. So the last few episodes, we've been talking about these 4 core wounds. And I do recommend that you go ahead and listen to the trust wound and listen to the abandonment wound, because now we are talking about the neglect wound. So give you a little bit of a summary, which is that all of us have these 4 wounds that are the primary reasons for why we do and think and act and show up in the ways that we do as adults. And we have a primary wound, which is kind of like our default wound. It's like the big one that some of us are functioning from. And then we also have secondary wounds, like all the other wounds are some way, somehow sprinkled in that. But you'll sort of notice that there's a primary one that you function from, and that's probably what's impacting you in your healing journey right now. So because we're talking about the neglect wound, I do want to separate it from what is similar and dissimilar about neglect and abandonment, because there is a lot of overlap, but essentially neglect is from the things that didn't happen versus abandonment is from the things that did happen. So neglect is when you, any kind of way, are neglected. So emotionally, physically, spiritually, psychologically, financially, in any kind of ways where you are neglected from your basic needs as a child. And a lot of these wounds, as we've mentioned so far, are things that happen in your formative years. So you can develop these wounds in your adulthood and in your later years. Yes, trauma is possible at any point, but for the most part, these kind of start to happen in childhood. So your basic needs, without it getting clinical, is the obvious. Is like you want love, you want attention, you want some validation, you want care, you want to feel like you're, belonging in any kind of context. Your needs are essentially neglected. So unlike abandonment, which involves a distinct feeling of being left, neglect is about being overlooked. So it's like the lack of something rather than the presence of something. So neglect can happen even in households where, people are present. So they're physically there, but they're emotionally unavailable. So this wound kind of leaves this like internal void, and it feels like your needs are not important, your emotions are not important, and kind of like your existence doesn't matter. You're kind of made to feel like you're kind of part of the scenery, but you're not really a part of the experience. You're kind of in the background, but you're not never, considered in a certain way. So you might notice that, especially if you listen to the last episode, we were talking about abandonment and how some of these things are also overlap, like the neglect energy and the abandonment energy definitely has an overlap as well. So the key difference is neglect is passive, whereas abandonment is active. So neglect wounds come from what wasn't done, so the care you didn't receive, versus abandonment wounds are what was done, right? Like someone actively leaving you or actively rejecting you or actively, doing something that led to this wound to be present. So neglect also really emphasize the fact that you're invisible. So it's like you're unseen, you're unimportant, you're disconnected. So it's like, I know you're here, but I'm going to just glaze my eyes over you. If you're here, I'm not going to call on you. If you're here, I don't hear you. If you're talking, I don't, right? Like there's this part of it's like you're there, but you're not there. Whereas abandonment is you're afraid of that closeness because it's inconsistent, it's unreliable, it's inconsistent. So those things are there, the emotional, physical, mental, spiritual, financial, it's like it's there, but it's inconsistent. Whereas neglect is like it's not there at all. You know what I mean? It's like you're not being listened to, you're not being heard, you're not being considered in any kind of way. So neglect also really makes you undervalue your own worth, because imagine like growing up to the point where like your voice never mattered, or your opinion never mattered, or your needs never mattered, your pain never mattered, like nothing ever mattered. So when you grow up, you also you start to kind of be confused, like do I matter? Like, should I speak up? Do I try to learn boundaries? Do I need boundaries? Like, is this just how it is? Like, people are just abusive and neglecting, and like, that's just life and that's how it is. So you start to have this like narrative around whether or not your needs are valid, whether or not your desires are valid, or if they're important. There's kind of this undervaluation of your own needs and your self-worth. So let's talk about how these things can come to be, because we broke it down in a couple of different ways where we said most of these problems don't just like appear one day. They're kind of built over time. So there's a couple of different shadows of this neglect wound, which is the shadow of self-neglect, the shadow of self-sabotage, the shadow of rejection, and the shadow of isolation. And let's talk about it in this kind of way where, the shadow of self-neglect becomes a really big one for people who have this neglect wound. Because again, if you don't understand your own needs, it's really hard to advocate for yourself. So you don't know how to take care of yourself. So you don't know how to put your needs above anybody else because you don't perceive that you have needs. You think that this is like an unimportant thing to, care about. So there's a little bit of people pleasing there, but there's also kind of a hierarchy of needs where you put other needs before your own, to the point where you burn out, to the point of exhaustion, to the point of bitterness, to the point where you feel actually really angry that why do they get it, but I don't get it? I seek the thing that I want, I'm doing for you, but I don't receive it in return. So this can show up in friendships where you're doing everything for them. You're showing up for them in the way that you want them to show up for you. But like, because they don't know that you also want that, they don't provide it to you. Or maybe you're in a transactional relationship, but right, there's kind of this neglect of your own needs to the point where that burnout, that resentment, that bitterness, kind of that anger from within, and it starts to make you kind of mad. There's this anger energy with neglect too. It's like this burning fire energy, whereas abandonment has sometimes an anger energy, but it's more like flighty. It's more of rejection. It's more like avoidance energy. Whereas neglect is like, you feel like mad. Okay. So self-neglect is in so many different variations, so many formats it can show up in. You neglect your health, neglect your emotions, neglect self-care, neglect boundaries, neglect, your dreams. Have you ever done that, right? Like there's this like frustration energy. And we keep talking about perfectionism, people pleasing, overthinking, self-doubt, imposter syndrome. But these things are the shadows. The shadow of neglect, the shadow of self-neglect actually really manifests in the way that perfectionism shows up in your life. Because now you're neglecting your dreams, you're neglecting your desires to create, you're neglecting your creative flow. You're neglecting putting out your art, or just talking about the fact that you want to pursue this project or this creative endeavor. You don't say that. And there's this frustration that keeps building up in your body, because the more that you avoid that, the more it bottlenecks. It starts to live in your chest, starts to live in your throat, starts to live in your head. There's all of these different things that come up where you're questioning whether or not it's worthwhile for you to pursue that. So you avoid your personal goals, your dreams. You're kind of prolonging, but you're a great support for others. You're a hype person for others. And it's not to say like, if you have any of this, you've never done anything, or you've never done. It's not to say that. But we're talking about the dramatics and the extreme, but you might see the sprinkle of this neglect wound in many things that you're currently still working through. So next, let's talk about the shadow of self-sabotage, which really beautifully leads in from self-neglect. Because like if you're used to being neglected, you're also probably used to neglecting yourself. So you're subconsciously always undermining your success, you're undermining your worthiness, you're undermining your value, you're undermining it all the time. And it's a self-sabotage behavior at the end of the day. Because you could just bother to like yourself. You could bother to just like be imperfect. You could bother to do that. But then there's like this feeling of not good enoughness. Because as soon as your desires come to the surface, you shut it down. You are doing to yourself what others have done to you. Now, let me project that onto somebody else who might be experiencing a neglect wound, who is now projecting it onto you, where you might not have a neglect wound and you're just like, here's my dreams, here's all of these different things. And they do that to you. They make you feel like your thing is crazy, your thing is unimportant. They don't hear you when you said that. They don't actually take you seriously. They don't actually listen to, they're projecting their fears and worries onto you. There's all this kind of projection energy that's happening because they're functioning from their own neglect wound. And that's why I often say that sometimes, as much as manifestation and law of attraction, all this kind of stuff is like, yeah, you do have to say it out loud for things to manifest into your life. Sometimes you're talking to the wrong people. Sometimes they're projecting their own fears of like, onto you. And it's like, these are not my fears. These are your own projections of your own self, your own worth, your own value, your own process, your own creativity. That's your shit. I don't have this, like, stop giving it to me. I can't talk to you about dreams and visions and delusions and like, something crazy. I can't talk to you about it because you're going to just put it down. You're going to project that. So you might notice that you actually experience other people's neglect wounds in this pathway, right? So do you relate? Is that a little triggering? So that self-sabotage shows up as procrastination and making choices that derail your progress, right? Like making choices that's going to take you out of the pathway. So as soon as you stay consistent or disciplined or, find some kind of consistency in your pursuit, whatever that looks like for you, you don't really know how to deal with the success of that. So as soon as you find like, oh, I've been consistent for 2 weeks, you all of a sudden take a 3-month break. It's like, okay, well, now you're going to start at square one. So you're kind of not giving yourself the evidence to see the pathway of your success. You're not seeing the compounded effort pay off, right? Effort over time means compounded effort. It's not paying off in the way that it could if you were to just put in small efforts daily or small efforts in whatever format works for you in your life and schedule. So the self-sabotage is procrastination. It's, derailing your progress. What else? Oh yeah, staying in unhealthy situations. Self-neglect is so big in that way, and situations is not always like the thing that comes into mind is a career choice, but it is sometimes outside of that too. Right? Because it's not always like, oh, you're neglecting yourself if you're in a career that doesn't make sense for you or that you enjoy or love, because there is like fear of finances, right? Fear of being able to like live and pay rent and, eat food, like, true, real fears. And also there's possibilities of other things that are manifesting and showing up in your life that you're kind of like 1 foot in 7 doors, it's like, it's really hard to keep. You have 2 feet, at most. You have 2 feet at most. And so to keep 1 foot in every single place is like, it's going to feel like you're being pulled in multiple directions rather than really just being able to go with the flow in one direction, even if it requires you to let go of some of the control. So perhaps some of that trust issues come back from when we talk about the trust wound in a couple of episodes ago. So then you have the shadow of rejection, where again, there's some overlap within all of these wounds where you're avoiding that self-compassion that's necessary in nurturing yourself in any kind of way. Nurturing your goals, nurturing your ideas, your projects, your passions is an act of self-love. It's not an act of discipline. Discipline is devotion, and devotion is an act of self-love. It is all cyclical in that way. And so when you are in the shadow of rejection, you're not really allowing yourself to have a compassionate choice, because sometimes the compassionate choice is to follow your dreams. And sometimes the compassionate choice is to, stick to your 9 to 5 and have your 9 to 5 be your sugar daddy while you're pursuing your dreams. The compassionate choice might be to have enough discipline and care for yourself to be consistent, even when you don't feel like it. And sometimes the compassionate choice is to give yourself a break because like you're going into burnout territory. That's not the blueprint I can give you. That is the blueprint that you have to navigate through the work of your own shadows. Your own shadow work is going to let you see that. So whatever that balance is when you're so afraid of rejection, you kind of neglect your own needs, your physical routines, your emotional care, your self-care, your like hygiene. You know, some people out here smelling like not that great out here. You know what I mean? And then just the way that you're interacting with your dreams, but while neglecting like your physical health or sunlight or the way that you're feeding yourself or the way that you're doing all these things. And I'm not at any point saying like, oh, like perfect. You can do this all perfectly, right? Like, it's not that you're going to be able to do it in perfection, but you're going to be able to see yourself like, hey, what is the compassionate decision that I can make for myself, that I can see myself as a holistic person. So it's not just like really being physically fit, but also having the creative fitness too, or the emotional fitness, or the intelligence that I can build in so many different ways. And we've talked about this in so many different ways in this podcast as well, not just through this shadow work series, but you constantly hear me talk about like, yeah, don't get addicted to your healing either. You know what I mean? Like that's part of that, you know, emotional intelligence building and the self-mastery, but then don't get addicted to that to the point where you don't have a fucking hobby, to the point where you don't have like friends, to the point where you don't have, you know, other things that are needing balance. And some seasons are going to be, yeah, you spend more time on this and more time on that and less time on this and more time, right? Like there's going to be an ebb and flow in like where your focus and attention and energy is going. And that's cool. Like that's the beautiful thing about human life is that there's going to be cycles, there's going to be rhythms, there's going to be all this beautiful stuff. But the shadow of rejection is rejection of self, rejection of self-care, avoiding thinking about yourself in a integrative and holistic perspective where you're ignoring different things. Now, I'm going to go on my high horse even further for another minute or so and say, this is very true about having any kind of hobbies in your life where you see people who are just so hyper-focused in one thing or the other for too long to the point where they don't actually have any enjoyment or excitement in their life that is outside of like the work that they're doing. And sometimes, as I mentioned, like sometimes your work is so much like that passion, that excitement where everything that you're doing is like creatively focused in that sometimes. But then you also have to look at like, can I have a moment off of this? And if I take a moment off of this, do I still feel like I'm good enough? Do I still like myself? So do I still bother feeling like I'm worthy of enjoying the things that life has to give me? Whether it's like a 20-minute break or, you know, I'm taking 2 days off of this project to like go enjoy the outside or do this and that. Am I feeling attached to this right now? And then attachment is like something to navigate. And I've spoken about it in this podcast as well, where a couple years ago, I told you, I was like, oh yeah, I'm just going to like drop all my projects and, you know, just be in Portugal for a little bit. And I did, you know, because I was navigating whether or not I was attached to having projects all the time. And the conclusion was like, oh no, I actually enjoy the things that I'm doing. It's not from a place of like having to prove or do or to create. And it was really nice to discover that from a nervous system perspective. And the way that you pick up projects or don't pick up projects should come from a place of excitement. And even if there's fear attached to it, I don't think you ever get rid of fear. But when you transmute and alchemize fear into excitement, it's just a lot easier to do stuff. There's just more of a enjoyment energy, a pleasure energy, a joy energy. For me, it's playfulness. Like here I am blabbing at you at a podcast called The Playground for a reason. You know, I run Always Play Studio. There's like there's a theme going on here, and I don't want to lose that about myself. It's a reminder to me as much as I'm, you know, speaking to you and hopefully helping you see something about yourself as well. It's a reminder to me to not leave that play energy. So self-care to you has to be defined by you. For me, I don't want to take things so seriously where I forget to have fun. And I've done that. I'm like, oh, wait, why did I imprison myself into something that I don't even fucking enjoy? Even creating like a 22 episode series, it's like, oh, did I like punish myself to do that? You know what I mean? And the answer is no. It's like, oh, this is easy. This shit is easy to me. I'm just like, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, should have this been a 50 episode? You know what I mean? Like, that's the joy of creation. That's the playfulness that allows me to be in my gift. So when you're dealing with this neglect wound, you have to see, like, where is it that you're neglecting yourself from your own art, your communication, your form of being seen and heard. I enjoy being seen and heard for my thoughts and the way that I can integrate different domains and categories of study, wisdom traditions. This is actually a skill set I have as a former researcher and a current researcher, as somebody who is a dancer, a musician, and an artist and a writer. Like I love being able to dance around all these worlds, and I don't love being just like boxed in. So part of my self-care is to allow myself the permission to explore across domains. And also to keep in mind, like, oh, am I just like abandoning something? Am I abandoning this? Am I abandoning that? I also have to navigate that too, as part of my own healing too. And the answer being like, no, actually, every one of us being such multidimensional people, we have to understand where we're participating in self-neglect versus actually really allowing ourselves to, pursue the things that we want. Feeling into how I want to close out this episode, there is also the shadow of isolation that is a big one in the neglect wound, which is, withdrawing from others. It's like not letting other people love you. And again, it's not always romantic. It's not always friendship. It's just like, let someone appreciate you. Because you're just withdrawing from others due to the fear of hurt or rejection, trying to prove your value. You're shutting down emotionally. You're in avoidance, if you will, right? All of these things are just like self-preservation. It's self-protection. And so because I don't want to feel all these things, I'm going to just like close myself off. Well, that's a little bit about the neglect wound there. I hope you resonate with something on here. And if this episode hit you in any kind of way, I'd very much appreciate you taking a screenshot of this episode and sharing it on Instagram. Tag me at shanila.satar and let me know what it is that you took away from this episode. And if you're down to heal through some of these wounds that we're talking about and do shadow work with me in the new year, head to www.alwaysplay.org/shadow-work. And you can also find this link in the show notes where we're working with each other for 6 weeks in a group format, looking at our shadows, the trust wound, the abandonment wound, the neglect wound, and also the guilt wound, which will be the next episode. So if you're down to come heal with me, definitely hit me up. And just remember, the world is your playground. And until next time, I will catch you soon.